It was closest I want to come to death. Fog we were in did not allow us to see the ground until we were down to about 400 feet. Survival is the only thing we were looking at, and we had passengers on board. Lightning was a constant factor, and thunder, even above the noise of the engines, could be heard. But lightning formed static electricity on the windscreen and on the propellers, and sometimes it built up to the point where there was a ball of fire that came through the instrument panel. When we sighted the UFO, it was nighttime. One of the pilots, no, it was the captain that pointed this out on his side of the aircraft, a short distance away. It was a dark object. It wasn't scary or anything else at all, but it suddenly left us.
Welcome to InSPiRaTiONS, podcast show about art, positivity and enthusiasm. And here is your host, Juliana Marinkovic.
Flight is a freedom in its purest form, to dance with the clouds which follow a storm, to roll and glide, to wheel and spin, to feel the joy that swells within, to leave the earth with its troubles and fly, and know the warmth of a clear spring sky. That was an excerpt from Gary Claude Stoker's poem called Impressions of a Pilot, and I think that those lyrics are the best introduction for the following interview that was done on April 28, 2018. Everything happened a few months ago when I accidentally stumbled upon a TV interview with pilot Bob Gartshore that was done for CTV News, television network in Canada, and the interview immediately caught my attention. Bob is the author of the great inspirational book A Life of Flight, where he is speaking about his amazing aviation career. He was born in 1931 and raised in Calgary, and he logged more than 21,000 flying hours during more than 40 years of flying. He flew a variety of airplanes from Piper Cubs to Boeing 747s, and his book also gives great insight into one part of history of aviation. And of course, when you have such a rich career, it is given that you will have a wide range of experiences, and to name just a few: dangerous near-miss incident, encounter with ball of lightning that was formed within an airplane, and even a mysterious event like flying beside UFO over the Pacific Ocean. I want to thank once again to Bob for his patience to do an interview so we could go through his book with more depth for our listeners, and also special thanks to his son David Gartshore, who was kind enough to help me to arrange this interview with Bob. So coming up, telephone interview with Mr. Bob Gartshore on a podcast show InSPiRaTiONS, only on OmniTalk Radio Network. It's a great pleasure today to speak with Mr. Bob Gartshore, who has a great book, A Life of Flight, about his amazing aeronautical and pilot career. I enjoyed it quite a bit. It also gives an interesting historical perspective into flying. So I called Bob today. I guess you are there in British Columbia, right, Bob?
Yes, that's true.
That's great, and we will talk today about his book and chronology of interesting events that happened to him during his pilot career. And I guess we can start in a usual way. Can you tell us something about your early years, where you were born, and how you have found your first inspiration towards flying and aviation?
Well, I was born in Calgary, Alberta, next door to British Columbia, and I had mother and father, had a younger brother 3.5 years younger than I was, and my father took me flying when I was quite young. We went down in a Lockheed Lodestar down to Lethbridge, Alberta, which is a distance of about 1 hour flying or a little less, and the aircraft belonged to TransCanada Airlines, And it was just a regular passenger service down to Lethbridge, but I was given a window seat, and I was asked to come up in the cockpit and look at the cockpit when we were flying. And I was quite interested in everything that went on, and I thought that would make a wonderful career. And ever since then, I've been interested in flying. During the war years, of course, I was interested in trading cards with my fellow students. We had trading cards for aircraft identification. We could tell the difference between a Spitfire and a Hurricane and a Lockheed Lightning, for example. And so I was interested during the war, and interested because of my dad's allowing me to fly with the Lockheed Lodestar down to Lethbridge and back, and I got really enjoying watching seagulls taking off and land and other bird life at Sylvan Lake, where we spent the summers. So all in all, it was an interesting career. My brother and I were both going to be aeronautical engineers, but war years prevented that. For me, at least, I didn't want conscription to take me into the Army. So I went up, I canceled my application with university and went up to the induction place in Calgary, and applied to join the Air Force and was accepted.
Yeah.
So the rest is there, yeah.
Yeah, we are speaking about Korean War now, like you described, right? So you, like you said, then moved toward the pilot career, and the training was pretty much interesting. And for me, especially from the historical perspective, it was really interesting to read about the, for example, link trainer device, which was used for instrumental flying. I guess for today's perspective, it is maybe harder for people to understand, but can you maybe explain at the time how this was used? It is a very interesting section in the book.
Yes, well, thank you. It's a link trainer is a unit mounted on a pivot in a room, and the inside of the link trainer is a cockpit mock-up, a very rudimentary cockpit mock-up. And the link trainer can be flown with the hood down, closed, so that the student does not look outside at all, and flies along with an aircraft sounding noise. And to the side of the aircraft is a table on which is a map. And the link trainer can be flown along an airway on the map. The instructor can watch, and the student can receive radio signals that would indicate where he was. So with the radio signals in a closed environment with basic aircraft instruments, the student can plot his course along the ground according to the map on the instructor's desk. So that's pretty well what you do is used for navigation, blind flying navigation.
Yeah, and besides that, you also had night flying, acrobatic flying too, so it was pretty much extensive training. And in the end, you became a pilot. And if I recall from the book, there was also interesting to see when there were also some extreme conditions, especially during the training, also low temperatures. So there was a different variety of training obstacles, right?
Yes, it was an interesting amount because we reopened Gimli, Manitoba, which is an airport just north of Winnipeg. And Gimli is where the Boeing 767 ran out of fuel and landed at that field in later years. But we used Gimli, Manitoba it was reactivated after the war for the Korean War. And we learned to fly during the Korean War at Gimli.
Later you were flying instructor yourself. That part of the story stuck with me, and I'm speaking now about the part when you had to teach NATO students. Like you explained in the book, they couldn't afford to fail, since everyone expected from them to be on top of things. That created tense situations sometimes, and especially during one incident when disaster almost happened. Can you expand more on that particular event?
Yes, well, we were above a lake, a small lake in Saskatchewan, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and flying along. But the student froze on the controls, and the aircraft in a stall position commenced to spin, which is a rotational around the vertical axis. And in that spin, one wing is completely stalled, and the other wing is not. So the aircraft tends to stay in the spin as long as you don't do something violent to prohibit it, to stop it. And to stop the spin, you have to put the nose down to gain flying speed in the other wing. Once that is done, the aircraft will stop the spin and recover in a dive. So with that in mind, the student put the aircraft into a spin, and I couldn't. He has a longer control stick than mine, and he could freeze on the controls on his stick in front of me, and I couldn't dislodge his stick from his hand, so we would have crashed in the lake had I not pulled my stick out of its socket and reached forward through the coop top and poked him on the head and made him shake his head and release his grip on the stick. So it was fairly close. I imagine we recovered maybe 50 feet or 100 feet above the water.
Wow. And if I recall, you were discharged from Royal Canadian Air Force in 1956. But I do recall that you mentioned in the book that one of these NATO students in the end died, right? He flew into a barn, if I recall.
That's correct. He was showing off or something, and he went too low. And the aircraft wasn't able to climb above the barn, so it went into the barn. He didn't realize, I think, how close he was to the barn and how fast he was traveling. I can only think that's what happened, but I don't know, because he's not allowed to ask.
Yeah. After the Royal Canadian Air Force, I think you started to flew for the flight company CP Air. And there was also one interesting anecdote back in 1957 when you flew a cargo of penguins. So can you describe us the condition of these flights and what happened there?
Oh, the penguins. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, a friend of mine was flying the aircraft south of Lima. The route went from Lima, Peru, down to Santiago, Chile, and across to Buenos Aires. And that was flown by a crew that was based in Lima, Peru. And my friend Boyd was on that crew, and he picked up the penguins in Santiago, Chile. They were brought up from the Antarctic. And he flew them from Santiago, Chile to Lima, Peru. And my crew took it from Lima. I think there were 26 penguins altogether in the cargo hold. Took it from Lima, Peru, and we went up to Mexico City and probably El Paso, Texas for fuel, because Mexico City is a very high altitude. And then on up to Vancouver, where Alan Best, the curator of the Vancouver Zoo, was able to take the penguins out. And I understand that we only lost one or two of them, but the rest arrived safely. But it was interesting trying to walk them up and down the tarmac at the various stops we made because they had to be exercised.
So they actually to escape during these exercises, right?
Yeah, we pulled them out of their cages, 2 by 2 or three at a time, and walked them up and down the tarmac, put them back in the cages, and then take the next 2 or 3 out of their cages and did the same thing. We had an hour or an hour and a half at each stop for refueling and passengers, and so we were there for enough time to exercise each of the penguins. We had two at a time, each person took 2 at a time, and walked them up and down for exercise. It was very interesting, and the penguins were very obliging.
And also you had some extreme encounters with natural phenomenon in 1959 during your flights from Honolulu. During these events, you experienced some extreme thunderstorms, and you also encountered ball lightning. Can you describe us these events?
In Canadian Pacific Airlines, we were flying down from Honolulu down south to the Auckland, Peru, for the other crew to take it on to Perth or to Sydney. And we flew into Honolulu, and then south from there, there's a front surface called intertropical front between fronts. And we, about 2 hours, 3 hours south of Honolulu, there's a solid wall of thunderstorms, generally speaking. And we didn't have radar, so we couldn't dodge the cells at all. We had to just go blindly into it. And lightning was a constant factor, and thunder, even above the noise of the engines, could be heard. But lightning sometimes, all the time, formed static electricity on the windscreen and on the propellers. And sometimes it built up to the point where there was a ball of fire that came through the instrument panel and dissolved over the instrument panel and then re-emerged the other side in our side of the instruments. And the cockpit crew just made way for it. Usually it was in the center of the aircraft between the two pilots. And occasionally one ball of fire would drop over the instrument panel and land on the throttles and then go down from the throttles. It happened just a couple of times that I recall, once particularly badly, and then would usually dissolve in the cockpit with a bang. But when the stewardess opened the door, I guess let a fresh air in, and the ball of fire just simply started going downhill toward her. And she turned around. I don't know where her coffee went, but she turned around and ran back. And the ball followed her all the way down the aisle, to the amazement of the passengers. And she went into one lav on one side of the airplane at the rear, and I think she said that the ball of fire must have gone on the other side because she heard it explode, but she wasn't involved in it. But it always blew the static wicks off the wings and tail, so we had to replace the static wicks all the time when we got to Auckland. But it was just one of those exciting experiences that we were privileged to see.
Yeah, I used to read about these events in some articles that these phenomena would be visible in the airplane, but you are actually the first person that I'm speaking with who actually saw it directly inside the airplane. Do you recall what was the length? How long the ball of fire was visible inside of the airplane?
Oh, probably a minute. I'm just guessing. It's a wild guess. It came down from the throttle quadrant onto the floor between the pilots, and then the stewardess arrived with our tea that we ordered every hour, and it followed her back down the aisle. I don't know whether she should have come. She was very daring to come because of the turbulence, lightning. But she was there nonetheless. She was a very dedicated person, I must say, because normally everybody is strapped in under those conditions.
Sure.
But we had a very good bunch of stewardesses, very dedicated.
Can you maybe recall what was the approximate diameter of that ball of lighting that appeared in your airplane? And was it maybe possible to hear if any sound was produced by the phenomenon?
The size of the ball? Probably,
yes.
Probably a foot in diameter.
Any sound maybe? Do you recall something about that?
The sound of it, we didn't have any sound at all because of the noise of the engine and the noise of the thunder around us, because it's very noisy. The lightning hitting the aircraft, of course, there's a thunder ball or thunderstorm that we were in. So the ball of fire was no noise at all from it as far as we were concerned.
Sure, yeah, in these conditions then, of course. Yeah.
Too noisy.
Yeah. You also had one experience on Greenland when you tried to land, but there was a problem with visibility. Again, a very tense situation on Greenland.
Yes, it was closest I want to come to death.
Oh.
When the fog we were in did not allow us to see the ground until we were down to about 400 feet. And we had no right to be down there. It was totally illegal. But survival is the only thing we were looking at. And we had passengers on board. And we tried at 800 feet, but that didn't work, so we went down to 400 feet. And we could see the ground very close by. 400 feet is more or less treetop level here. We have pretty big trees. But it was certainly a last resort to get down that low, where we could see the ground and see the hills rising up. But we had about 600 feet visibility, and the fog was fairly dense. So the only time I was caught that way in fog, where it was a life or death matter, because we had no right to get below a couple thousand feet under those conditions. But when you're looking at death, you do what you have to.
Absolutely. I just want also to mention that was during your flying for the war there, and I think that was 1965, right?
Yes, we joined in 1962. So 1965, we were flying with the war there, yes.
Oh, okay. And another spectacular site was connected with underwater volcano. I think you also have pictures in the book. And that happened in November 1963. Can you describe us the site and everything about that spectacular view?
Yes, right. That was Iceland.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, we were privileged to look at this underwater volcano before it broke the surface, or just as it was breaking the surface. And that's the way the islands are formed, apparently. There's Surtsey is the island that was formed, but there are several other islands just south of Iceland on a ridge, and each one was formed by an underwater volcano.
This eruption, right, reached several thousand feet in the air. It could be seen from many, many miles away.
Yes, I don't think it was thousands of feet. Maybe it went up to 1,000 feet. I don't know what the height was when it finally settled down, but it was a fairly large island. The bird life occurred miraculously just a week after the volcano was settled down. So it must be fairly rapid growth of trees and shrubs or something for bird life to come in.
And and people can see the picture also in your book about that event. Now we can move to October 1959. And this was also very interesting for me too, because I spoke with many pilots. I have some connections also with the aeronautical community, and from time to time I do hear about serious UFO sightings. Your event happened in October 1959 when you were flying from Lima, if I recall. In your book you have mentioned that the captain pointed to what appeared to be a black airship flying on the left-hand side. It was difficult to judge the distance, but it was possibly 200 yards away. For our European listeners, that will be around 180 meters. And it appeared to be a dim row of lights running its entire length. It kept pace with your airplane for several minutes before climbing rapidly to the west, and it didn't seem to have any hot exhaust. Can you give us more details about that event?
That was when we sighted the UFO, which is unidentified flying object. Well, it was nighttime, and one of the pilots, I don't know whether it was the captain, that pointed this out on his side of the aircraft, a short distance away. I don't know how far away it was. You can't tell. But it was nighttime, and it was a dark object. There was no moon out, or the stars were not very bright. But there was a dark object to our left, and the captain pointed it out with some what appeared to be lighter areas in the center of the aircraft, the center of the object, and running the whole length of the object. And it was quite dim, but we remarked on it, but several UFOs were sighted the same year, and we didn't think very much of it. It was just one of those unidentified objects, and we put it in the logbook or reported it, and that was it. It wasn't scary or anything else at all, but it suddenly left us. It climbed rapidly away to the side, and we saw it going up and disappeared in the distance. There were no sign of engines at all. No, that's right.
Yeah, and of course it was a night, and like you said, it was a row of lights. So could you discern the shape of the object?
Yeah, well, it appeared to us as though it was a Zeppelin shape. You know, the old Graf Zeppelin.
Okay, like a cigar.
Airship.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what it looked like, sort of a airship.
Yeah, was there any radio communication with air traffic control at the time? Have you tried to report the sighting to them in real time?
No, we were offshore. We were over the ocean, and
okay.
We did not have contact with air traffic control. We could radio, using the high-frequency radio, we could radio to Montreal usually, and I don't think we reported it then. We just wrote it in the logbook. It wasn't an occurrence. I think that the captain chose not to alarm the passengers or not to point the passengers out because it was nighttime and a lot of the passengers were sleeping. And so we didn't want to wake them up to tell them that there was this object on our left.
Sure. And this is especially interesting. Like you said, you were using in these years high frequency, that would be shortwave communication, right? Which was very unstable. I think you also have a section in the book where you are describing how this shortwave radio was not always stable due to atmospheric conditions, right?
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
High frequency.
Yeah. Have you tried to speak with other pilots at the time on these routes to try to check have they maybe seen something strange, or this was just one-off event that you sort of quickly put out of your mind?
Yes, well, there were no other aircraft around as far as we know. The skies were completely uncrowded off the west coast of South America. And there were no other aircraft there as far as we knew. So we were given an altitude and a clearance to proceed, and we used that just as our clearance until we got closer to the shore, where we were in contact with air traffic control once again.
Yeah, and in comparison with what you knew at the time and with the other aircrafts, do you think there was any comparable characteristics with these objects and with what you saw?
Well, we weren't aware of any other definitive reports on these. A lot of people just described it as I have, with a airship shape and dim lights in the sides of the shape, and none of the aircraft, none of the UFOs was scary in any. There's no hint of other than just observation, and there are quite a few UFOs sightings that time, and we didn't think anything really of it. They seemed to stop after a year or two of sightings.
Sure, yeah.
We're just privileged to see that one, yeah.
Yeah, it was one-off event, yeah. There is also one special and even inspirational story that while I was reading it, I titled it for myself Praying Incident from 1970. Event happened when you flew near London, when you had an airprox or near-miss incident, and there was a special connection with your wife Joy at that moment. Like you said in the book, she was awakened in the middle of the night when she heard single word, pray, and then she actually started to pray. So can you describe this really fascinating story? What happened at the time?
1970, we're flying an aircraft CF Zip from London, and we were approaching Manchester, and Manchester Air Traffic Control called, asking us to turn to the turn as we had traffic climbing through our altitude, and I guess they had not made allowance for wind, but there was a sighting more or less where we were turning, and we saw this speck in the distance in the clear sky, and it looked as though we were going to collide with it, and we could have gone into a dive, I suppose, but a dive is not nearly as quick as a turn, so we turned, and we rolled left to avoid it. They asked us to turn to the right, and we avoided it by turning away from it, we thought, and they turned to the right too, as far as I can aware, and we flashed past each other at about 1,000 miles an hour. And just a near miss, and it's absolutely startling how quickly the airplane got bigger. My wife was wakened at the same time, 8 hours time difference, and she was told to get on her knees and pray, and that's what she did. So she seemed to be quieting down after that. She went back to bed and went to sleep. And we compared notes. It was about noon when we went over Manchester, so it was 4 o'clock in the morning at home.
That was absolutely fascinating precognitive story, especially when you compared the notes with your wife. I mean, there was really no mistake, obviously.
Yes,
So, yeah.
It was startling to me because when I got home there, my wife met me as she normally does, and on the way back to home, she was driving, and she said, I had a funny incident. I was asked to get on my knees and pray in the middle of the night. And I said, what time was it? She said, about 4 o'clock in the morning. And so she complied, and I was over Pole Hill at noon, which is the same time. So we compared notes, and we thought she had a tap on the shoulder and asked to pray, which she did.
Absolutely amazing. I mean, of course, we can hear such stories from time to time, but there are a couple of them when certain conditions are met, they are leaving less doubt. And I think your case is one of those. When you hear it, it really gets you in a genuine way. So thank you so much for telling that. And we can just quickly go over something relatively similar that I found very interesting too in the book, and that is your anecdote about haunted house in Vancouver. Can you speak a little bit about that? I'm very interested what was happening in that house in Vancouver that you rented at the time.
Well, we had 2 3/4 sized beds in the bedroom, which is just off the living room in the house that we were renting. And there were curtains, heavy curtains on the door, double doors, as we entered the house that we closed at nighttime because of the lights outside. And in the middle of the night, I heard a noise in the living room, which Joy had heard before, but I had never experienced. And it sounded as though somebody was in the living room, and we had locked the doors the night before. And when I dashed out of bed, I was naked at the time, I don't mind admitting, and rushed out of the bedroom into the living room, and there was nobody there, and the door was still locked. But it sounded as though the curtains were being drawn rapidly aside, and the silverware drawer and the chest of drawers in the dining room, which is off the living room, sounded as though the chest of drawers had been pulled open, and you hear the rattle of the silverware. So we thought definitely there seemed to be somebody in the living room, until I went out to check, and it turned out nobody was there. And the door was locked, and the curtains were still drawn. So it's just what we heard. But we both heard it. So, and also my friend operated the simulator after I was using it, next to operate it. He heard it too when he was renting our house, the house that we were in. It wasn't our house, it was the house we were in.
Yeah, so the pattern continued. Do you recall, was there any frequency of these events? Like, I don't know, every couple of nights that this was happening, or this was again only one-off event?
How long did it happen?
Yeah.
Just once. I just remember the once, but it was definitely very startling. I don't think I heard it again because I went out on a trip shortly after that. Joy, I think she heard it once or twice after that, but I didn't hear it again.
Okay, yeah, that was really interesting part in the book for me. And okay, and for the end, I have last 2 questions. That was really funny for me when you were in the airplane and you announced to passengers that you are with your son. And can you explain to us what happened there? That was really a great story.
Yes, Brian is still flying today, and he's flying the 787, the Boeing Dreamliner, and he's a captain on it, of course. But at that time, he was my first officer, and he was my co-pilot as we graduated onto the Airbus. He was graduating onto the 747 with me, that's right. And on the 747, his first trip with me was to Honolulu and back. And arriving in Honolulu, he did a very nice landing. And I was very proud of him, of course, naturally, and told the passengers about that as we started taxiing into the terminal. And the stewardess some of the passengers automatically thought that he was a very young fellow sitting on his daddy's knee. And that has actually happened before with Aeroflot Airlines. Somebody apparently was at the wrong place at the wrong time and had a child on the knee and went into a dive that they didn't recover from. That's what I heard anyway. But the passengers were very upset about it. I didn't realize that they were upset until the stewardess came in and said, would you tell them your son is a licensed pilot? And not somebody, a little 6-year-old sitting on daddy's knee, which could have happened, I suppose, but not then. But he did a wonderful landing for his first landing with me. And I was very proud. And we had a very good time in Honolulu. The staff there was very excellent. They gave us a luau landing greeting and opened a bottle of champagne and give us lay floral wreaths and a bottle of champagne. And we thought it was very, very pleased. Both of us were very pleased. But Brian is now a captain on a 787 flying mostly to Asia. It's his choice. And he's just carried on from where I left off. He's now 60 years old.
Mm. Yeah, and after your retirement, you couldn't stop flying. You will also volunteer with Mission Aviation Flying of Canada, and there was an event when you encountered 3 MiGs. Can you tell us a little bit about that event?
Yes, we were flying out of Luanda, the capital of Angola, and sort of in between the wars. There was a very violent war for a decade, I think, before we went over there, and destroyed most of the Angola agriculture fields with landmines, and brought down several aircraft. We saw 737 sitting off the end of the runway, brought down with rocket fire from the ground. It was quite a violent time in Angola. I think it went on another 4 or 5 years after I left. But I was just asked to go as a relief pilot, and went to Angola via London, Brussels, down to Angola. The long way around. Nobody was allowed to fly over Africa at the time, so we had to go all the way around the large area of landmass to the west of Africa. So it took us a long time to get down there, and we found that things were in pretty bad shape in Luanda. We were staying at a staff house run by a couple of nursing sisters, which was very interesting. But we went into this one day that I mentioned there. We went into Uige, which is a small city in Angola, to the north of Luanda. And we flew for the United Nations for 3 days a week and through for missions for 3 days a week. And whenever we had a spare seat with United Nations, we were allowed to put our own personnel in the aircraft. It was a Cessna aircraft. And we took a pile of stuff for the United Nations into Uige and unloaded it there, and then took off again and left it at the end of the airstrip, Uige, and personnel were taking it away in carts. But we landed at Luanda, and 3 MiGs came in after us, did a victory roll over the airport, and landed. And somebody noticed, they said later on that the guns had been smoking, which indicates that they'd been firing. Mm. And apparently they attacked the airfield that we were just left, and killed several people, we heard. And all they got was a whole pile of Coke. Most of our cargo at that day was Coca-Cola. Mm. And they shot up the airport, destroyed the Coca-Cola, and a couple of people died, apparently. We heard later on. Yeah, we were very glad to be out of there.
Yeah. Definitely, Bob, amazing story. We can definitely point to listeners to check out the book. It is available, I think, on Amazon. It is also available on Kindle edition. That is how I also got it. A beautiful career, very inspirational story. And for the end, can you tell us some final words and also the meaning of your kind wife, Joy? That was really nicely explained in the book. Can you tell us something for the end about your book and achievements? And maybe if you will, I do recall that I saw that you also have some lectures from time to time. So can you tell us something for the final words, and if you have any future plans about book promotion?
Well, I can tell you that I had a very worthwhile career, a very fulfilling career, and I don't regret any part of it at all. But my wife was just great, and I can't speak highly enough of her. Indeed, she left a legacy of writings. She was writing for our church newsletter, quarterly newsletter, and after her death, we compiled all these writings and put them all into some form of order and published it. So her book is now available. It's called From Here and Nowhere by Joy Gartshore.
Oh, okay.
And it's probably on the internet too. But it's just stories of this, that, and the other thing that she wrote called From Here and Nowhere in the book. And that's what the stories were called when she published it, when she put it out in their church newsletter. So that was very interesting. That was published January of this year, and it's been well received, but it's a limited edition, of course. But it's interesting, and I certainly do miss her still. But she was a very interesting girl. I think in the book she talks about meeting me a couple of times, and the experiences she had meeting me. And I came in dead tired off an airplane, and she met me at the airport here at night. One particular story reminds me of her meeting me with sunglasses on in the middle of the night and hat pulled down over her hair. And you'll have to read it for yourself. It's quite interesting. But she left a legacy behind with 5 children, and our house is full of mementos of her. And I still miss her. Yeah, and it can be felt in the book. And I think it is a great achievement that you wrote this, and many technical details and many interesting and extreme incidents, sometimes very dangerous. And I think it will be also interesting for aviation buffs, for people who are interested in history of aviation. It has a great overview of your amazing career and a lot of personal details about your family and beautiful marriage that you shared. So this book should really be appreciated. Thank you so much, Bob. I enjoyed our conversation so much. And just last question, on the cover of your book, is that Brian or David on the cover of your book? Yes, that's Brian and myself on the cover of the book. Yeah, okay. That's our landing in Honolulu. And we had the the picture taken by the staff there at Honolulu.
Great. Thanks so much. We will be in touch. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for calling. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.